Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to start out with Dee Dowis, who died recently at the age of 48. Dee Dowis was the quarterback for the Air Force Falcons in the late 1980s, and he is among the greatest option quarterbacks of all time and is the greatest offensive player in Air Force history. He set all sorts of records, rushing and passing at the Air Force. His senior year, he came in sixth in the Heisman Trophy voting, which is one of the highest that any Service Academy player has garnered since Roger Staubach won the Heisman Trophy in 1963 playing for Navy. I saw him play against Northwestern at Dyke Stadium, where the fans kept yelling, "Show us your prowess, Dee Dowis." Here's an Air Force Academy report on Dee Dowis.
Many consider Dee Dowis the greatest quarterback in Air Force football history, directing the lethal Falcon wishbone triple option offense with tremendous skill. Dowis became the Air Force Academy's all-time career rushing leader with 3,612 yards, which was an NCAA record for a quarterback at the time. In his senior year, 1989, he placed sixth in the voting for the Heisman Trophy, which was won that year by University of Houston quarterback Andre Ware. During that 1989 season, he became only the fifth player in NCAA history to run and pass for at least 1,000 yards in one season. He was the starter for the Falcons in 1987 through 89 as Air Force roared to 22 wins and 2 bowl games and was named to the Air Force Athletic Hall of Fame as part of the class of 2009. He held a number of Air Force records, among them touchdowns, 6 of them in a game against San Diego State in 1989, and most points scored in a career, 252. He recorded 4 200-yard rushing games, 6,482 yards in total offense, and he ran for 41 touchdowns. Dee Dowis grew up in Royston, Georgia, also the home of baseball immortal Ty Cobb.
It didn't take too long to realize, he was incredibly skilled right from the start. Exceptional quickness, acceleration, a real knack for how to execute what we were doing offensively. And yet he just always had phenomenal, wiry strength. He's one of those guys that could go in the weight room, believe it or not, and he'd put a few extra rolls on the side of the bar and could really lift it up, even just in a hurry. And he had an incredible arm, a strong arm as maybe we've had in a quarterback here at the Air Force Academy.
He had this thing just like that, and he's shaking it out left and right, and he never fumbled the football. And so we sat there and, Deal scored a touchdown. We're all happy and everything, celebrate, go off to the sideline. Coach DeBerry grabs him. He's like, Dee, tuck that football in. And all you hear, Dee, is, yeah, Coach. And then the next thing you hear is Coach Noblin on the sideline. Dee, as long as you're scoring touchdowns, I don't care how you hold that football.
Dee Dowis wore number 6 for the Air Force Academy, and in his honor, they will place his initials on the 6-yard line of the Air Force Stadium. We're going to stay in athletics now and move on to our feature tonight, Vera Caslavska, who died recently at the age of 74. Vera Caslavska was one of the great female athletes of the 20th century. Most Americans may not recognize her name, but she was the top female gymnast in the world in the 1960s. She was a nice Czechoslovakian girl born in Prague. She won a silver medal in the 1960 Olympics in Rome. She won 3 gold medals in the 1964 Olympics in Tokyo, but her greatest performance was in 1968 in Mexico City, where she won 4 gold medals and 2 silvers. She was the top medalist in those Olympics, and she was named the Female Athlete of the Year in 1968. If she'd done nothing but that, she'd have an amazing story, but that's only part of her story, and probably not the most impressive part. We're going to start with this clip and tell the rest of Vera Caslavska's story.
The judges at this competition is Czechoslovakia's Vera Caslavska. In 1964 at the Tokyo Olympics, she established herself as one of the gymnastic greats with 3 golds and 2 silvers. Then, just after the Soviets occupied her home country at the 68 Olympics, she won 4 golds and 2 silvers, but not without a political statement, as Jim McKay described.
Listen to that roar for Vera Caslavska. And now the Soviet anthem. And again, she has turned her head to the right and down, just as she did at the last ceremony. This does not appear to be an accident.
You're looking at the woman that was my hero in 68. We're friends now, and I know the pain that she felt. I think the whole world knew.
Well, that pain was caused by the politics of 1968. In the spring of 1968, the leader of Czechoslovakia, Alexander Dubček, instituted a bunch of liberal reforms in the country that were seen as an overt threat to to the Soviet domination behind the Iron Curtain of Czechoslovakia. Leonid Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union, pondered what to do for 6 months until he decided to send tanks in and crush the revolt in August 1968, only 6 weeks before the Olympics began. This represented the most brutal repression of a country under Soviet domination in the Cold War since the invasion of Hungary in 1956. Not only was Vera Caslavska, who was the top Czechoslovakian athlete, a supporter of Alexander Dubček's reforms, but her main competition in gymnastics was from the Soviets. So Vera Caslavska was clearly a marked woman before the 1968 Olympic Games began. In April 1968, she had signed the Manifesto of 2,000 Words, which rejected Soviet involvement in Czechoslovakia. Warned that she was in danger of being arrested, Caslavska fled to the mountains. In hiding, she kept in shape by swinging from trees and practicing her floor exercises in a meadow. After 3 weeks, the government allowed her to join the rest of the Czech team in Mexico City. Caslavska competed under enormous pressure against Soviet athletes. Despite the rudimentary preparation, she successfully defended her all-around and vault titles, adding 2 more golds and 2 silvers. The Mexican people identified with her stand against oppression, and she became the star of the Games. She made her display very public on the Olympic medal stand when her Soviet competitors were awarded their medals, and they began to play the Soviet national anthem, and she turned her head away, which is what Jim McKay was describing. When she came back from the Olympic Games, the Soviet government demanded that she deny that she signed the manifesto, and she refused to do so. So the Soviet Union immediately exacted their revenge. She was unable to find employment as a coach in Czechoslovakia for 7 years after the Olympics, and she was essentially a non-person until 1989 when the communist government fell. President Václav Havel, whose podcast we've done, reinstated her, made her a part of his government, and she eventually got a position with the International Olympic Committee. Here in the United States, we remember the 1968 Olympic protest of American sprinters Tommie Smith and John Carlos, who, while they were on the Olympic podium, raised black gloves in a black power salute while the national anthem was being played. I can tell you that what Vera Caslavska did with her protest was far riskier, because it not only meant jeopardizing her career, it could have meant her life. Well, we're going to move on now to another prominent woman of the 1960s and 70s here in the United States, Phyllis Schlafly, who died at the age of 92. Phyllis Schlafly was an icon of the conservative movement here in America. Most of the political figures that I do on this cast are liberals. They tend to get more media exposure. But I have the same problem with Phyllis Schlafly that I do with some of the liberals. That is to say, their influence is overemphasized by both their enemies and their allies. Their allies tend to make them overly heroic in pushing their political cause, and their enemies tend to overly demonize them in terms of their influence. And in my opinion, that's the way it was with Phyllis Schlafly. She was definitely a counter to the left in the 1960s. She helped organize the movements for Goldwater. Without question, the conservatives regard her most important accomplishment was defeating the Equal Rights Amendment, which was a proposed amendment to the Constitution in the 1970s, proposing to give a lot of equal benefits and rights to women. The E.R.A. was passed by Congress in March of 1972 and sent to the states for ratification by both houses of the state legislatures. A proposed amendment becomes part of the Constitution when it's approved by 3/4, in this case 38 of the 50 states. During the next 5 years, 35 states approved the amendment. By the congressionally imposed deadline of June 30, 1982, no other states had voted yes, so the Equal Rights Amendment fell 3 states short of ratification for the Constitution. How important was Phyllis Schlafly? Well, if you listen to the conservatives, she was instrumental. I think she had a role. I don't think it was dispositive. 2 of the states that didn't ratify it were Missouri and Illinois, where she had most of her influence. But my impression was the E.R.A. was going to fall short with or without Phyllis Schlafly. She just became sort of a lightning rod. She was called an anti-feminist feminist. She was certainly accomplished, and she was certainly smart. I used to think of her as the anti-Gloria Steinem. And here she talks about her beginnings as one of the influential women of the conservative Republican movement.
Well, you remember Kennedy was assassinated in late November of 63, and I was at that time the president of the Illinois Federation of Republican Women, and I had a whole series of Republican speeches scheduled beginning in December, and it just seemed inappropriate to give a standard anti-Democratic Party speech. So I worked up a new speech called How Political Conventions Are Stolen, starting the first week in December of 1963, and then I gave that speech all January and February, And it told the story of how the Rockefeller establishment had outmaneuvered the conservatives and given the nomination to Me-Tooers like Thomas Dewey. And by March, I realized I could put it in a book and influence the convention. So it was a whirlwind year. I wrote it on my Royal Standard typewriter at night at home. And then, of course, I self-published it. You know, if you go to a publisher, it's going to take them 2 years to get their act together. And we needed it in '64. Marquette Press, that's the little publisher I set up to produce this book. So I sent it off to the printer in March, and 25,000 copies arrived at my garage on April the 30th. I typed out a one-page letter that said, "Dear friend, please read this book today and then buy enough copies to send to your delegates to the 1964 Republican National Convention." I typed a stencil in those days, and I had a mimeograph machine in the basement, and I went down the basement and put the stencil on the round thing and ground out 100 letters. I sent 100 letters out. It's the only advertising I ever did. And one of those letters was read by a friend in California who called up and said, "I read it. I'm going to a E.R.A convention this weekend. That's United Republicans of California. Air freight me out 5,000 copies. And so I loaded them up in my station wagon, took them down to the airport, sent them out there. And that weekend we had statewide distribution in California. The California primary was the first week in June. And we sold over 500,000 copies between the 1st of May and the 1st of June in California.
Where did the title come from?
Well, Barry Goldwater used the title, and the minute I heard it, I knew that was it.
Phyllis Schlafly, again, I'm not sure she was as important as the obits make her out to be, but she was certainly the most important female bridge from the Goldwater era to the Reagan era to today's Trump. And whether that's a good or bad thing, I'm going to let you decide. Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepps. And we're going to close tonight by going from right to left with Fred Hellerman, who died recently at the age of 89. Fred Hellerman was one of the original Weavers, the top-selling American folk group of the early 1950s. We've talked about the Weavers before when we did the Ronnie Gilbert podcast, and we also talked about them when we did the Pete Seeger podcast. And Fred Hellerman was not only a founder of the group, but he was the last remaining survivor. As we've talked about before, the group had to disband because they had, well, more than a little trouble with communist ties in the early 50s. Fred Hellerman was one of those guys who had left-wing ties in the 1930s and 40s, and those kind of politics weren't popular then, but hey, they've had a resurgence, Phyllis Schlafly notwithstanding. Here's Fred Hellerman with a couple of his fellow travelers, Judy Collins, Pete Seeger, and Arlo Guthrie singing "This Land Is Your Land," which was penned by Arlo's dad and is currently part of a copyright dispute. I guess this song isn't necessarily our song. The lefties in the audience are singing it as a patriotic anthem, which is what most schools do with it today, but in reality, Woody Guthrie wrote it as an answer song to Irving Berlin's God Bless America. A couple of ironies here. While This Land Is Your Land is under copyright dispute, Irving Berlin gave all the copyrights to God Bless America to the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts of America. And also, Irving Berlin, who wrote God Bless America as a patriotic song, grew up far poorer in the Lower East Side tenements than Woody Guthrie did in his middle-class Oklahoma home. But be that as it may, here's Fred Hellerman singing "This Land Is Your Land."
As the sun came shining, and I went strolling through the wheat fields waving, and the dust clouds rolling, as the fog was lifting, a voice was chanting, saying this land was made for you and me. This land is your land, this land is mine.
Well, I don't want to close on a controversial political note, and the Weavers, whatever their politics, were a great musical group in the early 50s. So let's close with the Weavers, and specifically Fred Hellerman singing one of the classics, Merle Travis's song that Tennessee Ernie Ford made famous, but the Weavers sang around the same time, 16 Tons.
Well, now some folks say a man is made out of mud, but a poor man's made out of muscle and blood. Muscle and blood, skin and bone, a mind that's weak and a back that's strong. You know, 16 tons, and what do you get? You get another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't